We'd like to welcome you to a conversation today that is going to be on the topic of rebirthing ourselves again and again. And this is done in part in celebration of Mother's Day, which is tomorrow. And it is also given with thought to the fact that today is the death anniversary of Helena Blavatsky, about whom we heard some discussion last week. And she has an interesting quote for today in our Still and Moving Center Almanac. The divine spiritual I, capital I, the divine spiritual I is alone eternal and the same throughout all births. So with that background as a question, what does that mean? The spiritual I or the spiritual self could be the same throughout all births. And this is something that was examined in ancient Greece by Plato. And so we have here to give us a starting presentation today, Cliff Tillotson, who got the opportunity to study Greek in college so that he could read Plato in Plato's native language. I think most of his study, however, of Plato has been in English, and he has really studied Plato continuously for decades. It's just something that's really dear to his heart. And so he's going to present to us Plato's myth of and I'll let him tell you about that. And
yeah, so I guess Renee wanted this theme of the myth of because of the rebirthing ourselves again and again. And the idea in the myth of is about rebirth, reincarnation. I took a quick look, I Googled it to see how many people in the world believe in reincarnation. And the result I got was 44% of the people in the world believe in reincarnation. And actually 25% of Christians in America believe in reincarnation. My mom was a Christian and yet she believed in reincarnation. So I always thought that was interesting. I encountered Plato in my freshman year in college. I fell in love with Plato at about pretty much the same time I fell in love with my wife, but she wasn't too jealous of the fact because he lived 2,300 years ago. So there wasn't too much competition there. Anyways, Plato might be considered, I think he is considered the father of Western philosophy, maybe Pythagoras as the grandfather of Western philosophy, who coined the term philosophy. But Plato, almost all Western philosophy after Plato is pretty much the footnotes or the commentary or the rebuttal to Plato. You can always feel Plato in the background of pretty much all other Western philosophers. That's how significant his influence was. He had the view that our entire, and as did his primary student Aristotle, that the universe is intelligible. It's intelligible, and it's intelligible because it's filled with intelligence. And we are part of that intelligence that is able to make the world intelligible or knowable. I think actually Einstein is very much a Platonist when he makes the statement that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible, which points back to us as the unveilers, the knowers, the intelligence, part of the intelligence that can make sense out of the universe that we live in through reason. So there's always this debate throughout life of the relationship of free will to destiny. And this could be seen to be, from Plato's point of view, the relationship of necessity, that on one side, that there is the realm of necessity, and on the other side, there's the realm of reason. And the more that we use reason, the more we are not bound by the constraints of necessity. The more choice we have, the more freedom we have. So it's not one or the other. There is both free will and destiny. There is both choice and fate. And they work in a dynamic way with Plato. In the Republic, which is Plato's most famous work, we often think of the Republic as being about a republic or about the ideal society or something. But actually, when you really look at the dialogue, that whole discussion, which actually takes up the bulk of the Republic, is really a tangent from trying to figure out what they do at the beginning of the dialogue to try and figure out what is the good life? What is the life that leads to happiness? And they play, or I think Socrates says that it's life of justice that leads to happiness. And he says that the best way to look maybe sometimes at something in the individual is to expand it and look at it in a larger sense. So if we look at justice in the entire society, we might get a better idea of how justice works in the individual. So then he goes off on this whole long tangent of talking about this utopian ideal state. But at the very, very end of the entire dialogue, which he wrote in the middle of his life, probably around the age of 40, he returns back to the idea of the individual and the individual's relationship to justice and injustice, and argues that while some people could say that, you know, the wealthy person or the more powerful person is the one that is the happiest, he compares it to life to a race, a long race, like a marathon race, where usually if people pursue wealth or power, they flag toward the end of the race. Whereas someone that is pursuing justice just for its own sake actually makes it to the finish line in terms of death, reaches death in a much more contented and a happy state. And then he launches into the after death state, the myth of which is pretty much kind of, I guess, the epilogue of the Republic. And the myth of is about this fellow that seemingly died on a battlefield and was laying there for 10 days. And then when they came to remove the corpses from the battlefield, they found and he hadn't decomposed like all the other fallen soldiers, but they still took him back to the city-state, the polis, and they put him on a funeral pyre, and they were going to, I guess, burn his corpse in the morning. But then just before they ignited the funeral pyre, he woke up and he had this story to tell about where he went. And where he went was he ended up with a bunch of other souls traveling to this meadow. And in this meadow, all these souls joined together for 7 days. And at this meadow, there were 2 portals going upward and 2 portals going downward. And the 2 portals upward were like an entrance and an exit, as well as the ones going down. And so while they were at this meadow, these souls that had just passed from life, they would see some souls coming down from above, from heaven or whatever. I think it's kind of analogous to the TV show The Good Place, coming down from the good place. And they're all clean and nice and happy. And then you have these dirty, exhausted souls coming out of the lower realm, the ground, and they've been through a realm of suffering for in both cases, roughly for about 1,000 years. Because all the good things you do in one life, which is roughly 100 years, get multiplied by 10 in the afterlife. And likewise, all the bad things you do get multiplied by 10. So therefore, you pretty much have to spend 1,000 years. One individual he remarks upon is a guy named Ardiaeus, who was a despot about 1,000 years ago. And every time he would try and come up out of the ground, these loud horns would sound, and then they would grab him and they would pull him back down underground. And he kept doing that over and over again. And as they did this, they would whip his body with these thorns. And Plato uses the word, they carded his body with these thorns. And I think that's an interesting analogy, actually, the carding of his body with thorns, because I think person like Ardiaeus, who killed his father and his brother in life, they have this entanglement of desires. And by and the idea of carding wool means to get it all realigned. So it's really hard if someone lives only by desire to get everything aligned in their soul. So that it requires this constant carding until they can finally get back up to the meadow and then continue. So after 7 days, they leave the meadow, they go to this other place, and there in this other place, they see this amazing shaft of light coming down from the heavens. And the shaft of light is kind of also a rainbow color, and the shaft is made of diamond. They call it adamant, which is a kind of like a diamond. And that's when Plato gets into this crazy description about how the universe, the inner universe, the zodiacal universe works here. And I thought I would, just for fun, if I could, I was going to show you how a spindle works, because I didn't really know how a spindle works. So I thought I'd just try and show you how a spindle works. Let me see.
Right now, I am spinning wool fiber, and the dyed wool fiber is not yet yarn. I employ my spindle stick and whirl, and it twists in one direction. The twist will run straight up towards the fibers. And my fingers are going to be the controllers of the twist. Basically, I'm pulling fibers out without twist with my lower and upper hands. And my upper hand is going to pinch. And as soon as my lower hand lets go, suddenly the fibers between these two fingers become yarn. I pull the fibers out, let go with my lower hand, pinch with my upper hand, and repeat. This is an ancient technique. Before the year 1200 CE, every piece of yarn in the world was spun with a spindle stick.
So that's the analogy that he's going to be using to describe the universe. And that one wooden part, the round part, is called the whirl. And so Plato goes into this description of this spindle that's spinning around, and it's spinning on the knees of the goddess Necessity. And Necessity was married to Kronos, the god of time. And apparently they had something to do with this egg that they cracked together. And these mythology things are really wild. And out of this egg came Necessity's 3 daughters, which are the Fates, also known as the Moreas, I think. And those 3 Fates are Laches, which is the fate of the past, Clotho, the fate of the present, and Atropos, which is the fate of the future. And so this world that it is a part of the spindle has all the planets and all the stars, and they're all spinning around. And on each of these, and they're like cups or bowls, and on the edge of each of these cups is a siren singing a single note. So they create this harmony of the spheres as this spindle is spinning around. And then as they're there, there is this judge, or I guess he's actually called the interpreter. And this interpreter takes these lots from the lap of the fate of the past, Laches, and throws these lots down in front of all the souls. And you're supposed to pick up a lot, and you're like number 1, or you're like number 100 or whatever. And then you get to pick your next life based on your number of your lot. And Plato makes the comment that a lot of people that were actually up in the higher realm, because of living a virtuous life, they get in the higher realm and they're kind of like habitually virtuous. And so they get lazy, and they quickly they'll pick a life that looks good on the surface, but they don't read the fine print. They don't read the footnotes of it. And next thing you know, they're a despot who's eating their children or something terrible like that. Whereas those that were down in the Netherlands, because of all the suffering they went through, they're much more cautious, much more deliberative actually in their choices, and often choose a better life because they read carefully what's going on. So a lot of times Plato's making the point that souls flip-flop between lives from a more virtuous life to a more life of vice, just because of intellectual laziness. They're not using reason. They're not thinking deliberatively. So then the interpreter, after each person chooses their lives, the interpreter says this, quote, "The word of Laches, maiden daughter of necessity, souls of a day, here shall begin a new round of earthly life to end in death. No guardian spirit will cast lots for you, but you shall choose your own destiny. Let him to whom the first lot falls choose first a life to which he will be bound of necessity. But virtue owns no master. As a man honors or dishonors her, so shall he have more or of her or less. The blame is his who chooses. Heaven is blameless." In other words, Plato's putting a lot of emphasis on individual choice, even in the after-death state. And he points out like Odysseus, who had that really exhausting life in Homer with the Iliad and then the Odyssey, his choice is to just live a really quiet life with no interruptions. And that's what he chooses to live. So then, after they each choose their life, then Laches gives each of these souls a guardian genius, which will follow them through their next life, and it will escort them through their next life. And then they travel through this huge kind of desert. It's called the plain of Lethe. And they get exhausted and really thirsty as they travel across this plain. And then they come to this river called the River of Forgetfulness. And some drink more of the River of Forgetfulness than others. If you're not using good judgment, you drink too much of this river and you forget a lot. But maybe if you just drink just enough, just to make it so you save your thirst, you have more memory. So after they all do that, then what happens is they end up being like shooting stars and they come back down into their next life. And this is how this chapter and the entire Republic end, by Socrates saying this. "And so, Glaucon, if you will believe with me that the soul is immortal and able to endure all good and ill, we shall always keep to the upward way and in all things pursue justice with the help of wisdom. Then we shall be at peace with heaven and with ourselves, both during our sojourn here and when, like victors in the games, collecting gifts from their friends, we receive the prize of justice. And so not here only, but in the journey of 1,000 years, of which I have told you, we shall fare well." So that's the kind of the story of the myth of that has something to do with rebirthing again and again, I guess.
Curious if you know or can expound on this genius that they assign to you when you're rebirthing.
That is a wonderful question, and I hadn't thought about it when I read it, but actually Socrates talks a lot about his daimon. And I think the daimon is your genius. And he would listen to his daimon for guidance throughout his life. And his daimon would only tell him what not to do, but never told him what to do. Whereas Gandhi referred a lot to his daimon as well. He didn't call it his daimon. He called it the still small voice within. And Gandhi's voice within not only told him what not to do, but in many cases, like the Salt March, told him what to do. So I think that's the idea there of the guardian, or not the guardian, but what was it called? The guardian genius is that inner daimon. Good question.
Yeah, it sounds really good answer.
I have a question. We were talking this morning about, I was working with gratitude and talking about, do we choose our life or we choose our life lessons? If we choose our life, do we choose the suffering that we do, or is our life random and then we respond to it? Or what does Plato, does he speak to that about our life lessons? Do we actually choose our life and our life lessons and how we're going to live it?
I think that you're going to the heart of the complexity of this seemingly, not too difficult myth, but it's actually, the more you dig into it, the more complex it is. Because he does say that you're choosing your life, but you're choosing your life under this goddess of necessity. So there's choice going on, but there's also, I think there's karma going on too, necessity. And so I think there's a blend there. And so it's not all free choice, and it's not all fate. I think it's complicated. It's both. And that's the best I can give you on that.
That's perfect. Thank you. I think it is both. That's an interesting thought, because with so much suffering in the world, and we see, how do people choose a life of starvation or death and all that? It's like, there's a certain amount of guilt that happens with people when they feel like, if we say they choose their life, why would I choose that? Or why would I choose my child getting hurt? Or it's like, there's sometimes becomes a guilt or a feeling of responsibility for all the bad things that are happening.
Yeah, one quote that always comes to mind in regards to what you're talking about is the quote that Martin Luther King gave when he gave the eulogy of the girls that were killed in the bombing of the church in the South. He went there and spoke, and in part of his speech, he made the statement that unearned suffering is redemptive. So this idea that sometimes suffering doesn't seem right. It just doesn't seem right in this context, in this case. But in the larger order of the universe being basically run by the law of karma, the law of equilibrium, the law of harmony, somehow if someone undergoes apparently unfair suffering or extreme suffering, there's somehow balance to that. And maybe wisdom that's provided if you look at life as many lives, with learning of the soul being the primary purpose of all this rebirthing that Renee's talking about in her comment.
Great, thank you so much. That's a good discussion.
Cliff, hi, Ramdas.
Hey,
I'm sorry I can't turn my camera on. I tried and it's not working. So, but I can hear you, and I guess you can hear me.
Yes.
But anyway, I'd like to just add a comment. First of all, thank you. Yeah, Plato is amazing, and he talks a lot about that which we end up finding within various Indian philosophies as well. But the concept of rebirth is, and the question that Diana just asked, there's a couple different ways in which my own monastic order looks at the issue of suffering. And one is that if I do something wrong, then I have to come back and experience something to kind of straighten it out. In other words, there's a penal element to suffering. But the other side of it is suffering is also a sign of advancement. And I'll give you a good example. At the university, if I have a student who does really poor in class, then they'll have to come back and take the class all over again. So somebody from the outside is going to look at that person and saying, well, that person is suffering because they've got to have one class and then they got to turn around and take the same class all over again. But the person who's doing it realizes, well, because they didn't get it right, so I got to come back and get it right. The other side of it is once you do really good, then you have to start taking really difficult classes, right? So the intro classes are easy. Once you start improving, you get up into your junior, senior year, you're taking really difficult classes. So once again, somebody from the outside is looking, wow, look at this person. One person's taking really easy classes. This other person is taking really difficult classes. Why? And they're really suffering, because that's where we learn. Suffering is the teacher. And so when we are ready to learn is then we're put in that situation so we can learn. And to the outside, it might look like we're suffering, but as a result of it, our soul is being expressed, and we are starting to learn, and we are starting to find out elements of ourselves that we will never find out in an easy life. And I think we all know that.
That's great. Thank you, Ron. Plus.
So, Cliff, there's a critical role then. I mean, in Buddhism and other places, life is suffering, right? Birth, death, having children, all that kind of stuff, right? What's the role of ideas? We all suffer, but how do we use ideas? And if Plato is a philosopher, then what is it about philosophy that helps us choose the right ideas?
Yeah. Well, I think I'm going back to Pythagoras a little bit on that, in that this one quote that I always fall back on from Pythagoras is, consult and deliberate before thou act, that thou mayest not commit foolish actions, for it's the part of a miserable man to speak and to act without reflection. I think the life of a philosopher is a life of reflection. It's a life of being deliberate, and therefore you can guide with philosophy and inner reflection and self-reflection. You can avoid a lot of pitfalls in life. You can avoid a lot of suffering, so you can learn it vicariously through others. You see, oh, that guy's doing that, but I'm not going to do that, Plato had Plato felt that ideas are in the universe. I don't know, can everyone hear me? Because your screen's froze up.
Yes.
Did I get off? Oh, there, I'm back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're actually ruling ideas in the universe. And by you trying to use ideas, deeper ideas, moral ideas, we're tapping into these forms, these archetypes, these fundamental ideas that are part of the intelligible universe that we live in. And we are intelligent agents in that universe. There's no separation between us and nature.
Mhm.
So I think that's part of it. What the philosopher is trying to do is reach higher and higher toward these archetypal ideas and let them guide his life, her life, anyone's life.
Cliff, do you get a sense that it's just a flip-flopping back and forth between one bad choice and another? Or, I mean, is it going anywhere? This choice the soul is making from one lifetime to another in Plato's story of the myth of Ur?
I think, going back to Pythagoras too, again, he describes most human beings, we live in a state of constant conflict with each other because we're more or less, living a life of reaction back and forth. Whereas Plato is saying that if we use reason, instead of just being caught up in like the sensory world, but if we use our reason, we can over time elevate ourselves out of kind of the realm of the emotions and the senses and so forth. And yes, there is an upward path that Plato talks about. And that's in that last quote, he says, if you will believe with me that the soul is immortal and able to endure all good and ill, we shall keep always to the upward way, and in all things pursue justice with the help of wisdom. So he is saying that there is evolution, soul evolution, advancement, but through reason, through the higher powers of reason.
Which is the source of happiness, right?
Right. But for the most part, I think Plato is also saying if we just live intellectually lazy or spiritually lazy lives, we do flip-flop. Maybe we do virtue and then we rest on our laurels, but then we end up getting lazy and making bad choices, when we choose our next life. So Plato is saying that we need to always constantly be diligently using our minds to the highest abilities we can. And deep soul searching with our minds, I think.
Kurt,
If I could tag on to that point, in the original, one of the couple of the original questions, do you think that, it's called the myth of right? But maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Is it this is sort of a lead into another question, but there's a viewpoint on myth that it's simply a sort of like a fairy tale, right? In a children's book. And it's, you can learn something from it, but it doesn't really have a connection with the real world. So if you could just address that a little bit. But the other thing I wanted to dig into a little bit more is this idea that choice, quote unquote, that is made by the soul prior to entering into the next incarnation. Do you think that that is actually something that's made at that certain point in an after-death state? Because that's one of the other things that's said about after-death states is they're affect states, right? You're not actually creating new karma in your after-death state. You're experiencing the results of the past life thoughts, actions, desires, etc. And there's a cleansing process that goes on, but you're not actually choosing something that's going to create new karma for you. So I just wonder if you could talk about where is that, and it's connected with the idea of myth, because I'm wondering if Plato is really saying that, in each life before death, we're making choices which are going to determine our next life, as opposed to something that occurs in the after death state.
I think, well, it's after you're disincarnated for 1,000 years that you're actually making this choice. Plato does say you're making a choice there under the goddess of necessity and so forth. But I think everything that you do in the life prior to that leads up to the kind of the inner conditions by which you make the choice. So he's basically saying that everything that you did in the past life is going to have a huge bearing on how you choose your next life. So, but there is a choice there, but like you're saying, it's a myth, it's a story. And I agree that probably, I don't know if that's actually accurate that you're making that choice. I don't know. There's fun things in this story about people choosing lives of animals and so forth. And I don't think that's probably accurate. It's part of the myth. But myth itself, I think is a mysterious thing. We've come to, like you're saying, change the idea of myth into fairy tale or something like that. But myth, I think, was a way to tell deep truths in a symbolic manner, often done in more of the secret schools of initiation, the Orphic tradition, and so forth like that. The mysteries were conveyed through myths, and then told actually to just children and everyone else as well. But the myth, behind the curtain of the myth, there are deep truths about the universe, about our own nature, and so forth. It's just hard to be able sometimes to plumb those depths without really knowing all that symbology, what's going on there.
That's a good answer. I know I recently ran across a quote from Joseph Campbell where he said that myth, what we now think of as myth, was once the true science of humanity, but that we're so distant from many of the truths that it represents that it seems like a fairy tale to us, kind of like that. But it's just I never really thought about it because I've heard the myth explained many times, but I'm thinking of also, the after-death experiences or near-death experiences that Moody started to document, and now there's many thousands of them now that have been documented because they have developed so many very sophisticated medical techniques to bring people back from what looks like, you know, a near death condition. In fact, they even have forms of heart surgery where they deliberately put people in like a deep freeze. They have to stop the heart in order to do the procedure, and then they restart. And because of that, they now have there's many thousands of medically documented, you know, near-death experiences that people have, you know. And Moody was one of the ones who started to see, oh, look, there's a pattern to what people experience. And one of the remarkable things that he says is that, first of all, that there's no fear, that this passage into a state of consciousness where the body is being left behind, loss of fear. There's no worries. There's no like trepidation about, you know, entering into a new state. It's like everything's fine. There's no problem. And then the other thing he mentions is there's four. I just recalling two of them. Is that almost across the board, people say that they discovered that, first of all, they lose their fear of death after that. That's you know, just in general, when they come back to life, it's like, oh, I may die someday. I'm not afraid of that. But also that they realize that the purpose of life is learning how to become more compassionate. So it's like this, deep psychological transformation that people go through in that experience. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Hey, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful to hear. That's good news.
You know, I wanted to mention that a friend of ours who was our Bharatanatyam teacher when Still a Moving Center was in its early days, has a son who's about 13 now. And when we met him as a little boy, he was the most philosophical little child that I've ever met. And when his younger brother was born, he just couldn't wait for that little brother of his to learn how to talk so he could ask him, what was it like before you were born? I want to remember. So as we have all these studies of, you know, people who have come back after a near-death experience. However, it seems like the babies can't talk right away to let us know what it was like right before they were born. However, I do believe some people have done studies of little children, and there are studies of young children who do remember their past lives. I haven't heard about this idea of choice right before they jump into a body. So it is an interesting question, and I wonder whether it's a lot connected with this idea you had, Cliff, of we have both freedom and necessity. So within this context of the idea of reincarnation, we have all these patterns and choices that were made in past lives that are going to be part of the necessity. There are just some things we can't choose because of our past choices. And there are other opportunities that we have opened up for ourselves due to our past choices. I mean, that to me, I always think of when we're running pell-mell toward the end of a cliff and we say that we have free choice. And there's a certain point at which we've lost our free choice, right? Some last step and we're going to be off. We don't have free choice. But up to a certain point, as we're running along, we have free choice. So there's both free choice and necessity there. So I'm wondering if something about what, in regard to what Kirk is asking, something about all of our past life experiences would form part of the necessity, part of the lack of choice. And then there's also some free elements of free choice that go along with that.
And
Like we've opened up opportunities for ourselves too.
I think you're absolutely right. The only thing I really wanted to add to that is I didn't really want to get into this spindle thing too much, but it's part of the myth of Earth. It's super complex. And I think he's sharing the spindle with all the planets and all their qualities and the fixed stars and the sun and the moon and how they all align at the particular time when you're making a choice or you're coming back. I really think that, for the Greeks and many other earlier cultures, they really understood astrology and how that was connected with astronomy and the alignment of the planets and all of that coming into, why do I have this personality instead of that kind of personality? So it's not just your own karma from the past life, but it's also, there's this whole other element of who you are is also connected with the solar system you live in and the timing at which you come into the world and so forth. And I don't know, it made me fascinated with the whole subject, much more of the zodiac and astrology than I was before, reading all this stuff about, the spindle of necessity.
Well, I, without diving into that, the idea of us being part of a whole means that we not only have the causes that we have set into motion effectively, but or individually, but we're part of a whole connected fabric. And so, for example, when you talked about the 3 little girls who died in the church, at which Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. spoke, when he said that unearned suffering is redemptive, they were born into a whole social context in which such a thing could happen, right? And somehow, if following the logic of this myth of they chose the lot to be born into that lifetime, they were born into a certain context, and what happened to them could serve to uplift a whole people who are so horrified by it, right? To see the injustice of something. So in addition to it being redemptive to them, it also was redemptive to a whole people who managed to pay attention to that and learn the lesson of it.
That's a great point.
If I could just tag onto that too, because yeah, it's a beautiful point. Because you have this idea that in the Greek tradition, again, the Prometheus is sort of being the exemplification of the descent of consciousness. It's you could say the fire of the soul descending into incarnation, but into a grand cycle of incarnations. And but the word itself meaning foreknowledge, Prometheus is foreseeing, and that, but it would be also, like Renee is mentioning, one would think that the vision, the soul vision, the transcendent spiritual vision of the soul would be one which takes into consideration the whole, the benefit that could be had, not for oneself necessarily, but for the whole, but also acknowledging that there are those aspects about incarnation that one really hasn't fully appreciated, and so needs to experience, maybe over many lives. And so that in that sense, as Ram Dass was suggesting, is that some souls perhaps would deliberately enter into a life of, what we would see as being tremendous suffering in order to understand something that otherwise could not be understood.
Or in the case of those 3 girls, to elevate, a context, like their contribution to civil rights and so forth.
Yeah.
I wanted to tie a little bit of the astrology, astronomy bit into that thing. I think when he references, some people don't bother to read the fine print. It might be like you didn't pay attention to what the time was you were running into, and that may be part of the fine print when you're reincarnating is understanding the dynamics of the time and choosing wisely from that awareness, which might take a couple of bad sessions first.
I'm sorry, just a quick comment.
Sure.
In line with that, I think what Kirk and Cliff have been talking about, when in my tradition, when a person dies, they don't say they died. They said their body is complete, and so what it means is they needed the body for a certain length of time to complete a task. The task has now been completed, and so that body is done. And sometimes we have a task that's going to take us 50 to 75 years, and sometimes we have a task that's only going to take us a few years. But what it suggests is that every life is meaningful, and every life serves a very important purpose. And so I think, Renee, what you were saying is that the three girls that Martin Luther King was talking about, they came and they served a very important function. And they fulfilled their purpose, and then they left. And what they left was a legacy and a teaching for everyone else. And so what they accomplished in those few years, some people take 50 to 75 years to accomplish.
Yeah.
But I have a question with all of this going on. What are we rebirthing?
Isn't it the same?
I think that's a question about what is the self.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the almanac, I say rebirthing ourselves, meaning each of ourselves. But for each of us individually, we're talking about what is that self, that thread soul that could be going through lifetime after lifetime. It's a huge and mysterious question. Evidently, the Indian sage Ramana Maharshi thought it was the only question.
Well, that is the quote for today, right? From H.P. Blavatsky, right? It's the divine spiritual I alone that is eternal. I'm only raising this because somehow this is being done on behalf of or as an agent of our own spirit and the divine spirit, the eternal spirit. And what the eternal spirit needs to learn, but there's something alone and eternal that goes through all of these births. So as we've said, and like Shakespeare says, right, in the quote, that sometimes we get to play the pauper and sometimes the king, and sometimes, we get to play all these roles, but the purpose, of course, is to learn, but to rebirth for the sake of the spirit, the sacred spirit, or if you want to call it God or consciousness, spirit, or the uncreate. We don't have to answer that.
One thing, Maurice, I'd add is
answer.
I'll just add. I looked at a couple of commentaries on Plato before I came into this talk, and in both of the commentaries I read, they were saying that modern views of what the soul is not what Plato or the Greeks were really meaning by the word psyche, soul. Mm-hmm. We have this more passive view of what the soul is, more of a thing. Whereas for Plato, the idea of soul was more active, more not so form-like. And so it's hard to, because we think we're kind of a materialistic culture. We think, I don't know, not in a way that what is the soul? You know, we think of it as some kind of thing, and it's not probably a thing. It has something more to do with consciousness. Consciousness is kind of like, what is consciousness? What is fire? You know, is fire a thing? You know, or is light a thing? But this thing, the soul force, this spiritual force that you're talking about in the quote by HPB, is not substantial in the same way that we think of as the material universe. You know, so it's very mysterious.
Would Plato think of the soul as self-moving? That it moves by itself. It's not dependent on other things to move.
I think that's be the essence of the soul. Yeah. He did divide the soul into three parts. The part of reason, the spirited part, and the appetitive part. And he compared it to a charioteer. Ideally, you want the reason to be in the driver's seat,
Right.
be the charioteer, and then you have the white horse and the black horse. And you want to, and the black horse is the appetitive part of the soul, and the white horse is more the spirited, the courageous side. But it's the charioteer's job to control those horses and get them to work together.
Right. And he said, did he say something? And you need one of those horses to really be a pain on purpose, to really force you to get that whole thing together, to be the charioteer, the soul being the charioteer, maybe, right? Who holds the reins through reason. But somehow you have to go through this experience, and one of those horses is going to be a real drag. Did he not say that? I think he did.
I can't remember. I can imagine.
In regard to this idea of whether or not the soul is a thing, we had a quote in April from Buckminster Fuller in our almanac. I live on earth at present, and I don't know what I am. I know that I am not a category. I am not a thing, a noun. I seem to be a verb, an evolutionary process, an integral function of the universe. I was talking to our speaker from last week, Judy Saltzman, after her talk, and I don't recall why. She was mentioning that the idea of reincarnation, which Blavatsky speaks of extensively, is one that, and Cliff, you mentioned at the beginning, 25% of Christians and 40% of people in the world believe in reincarnation. She mentioned that it is perfectly consistent for Catholics to believe in reincarnation because in a convocation or something that happened in like 393, the Catholics did not object to the concept of reincarnation. And I wondered if anybody is knowledgeable enough, since we don't have Judy Saltzman here, to know what that history is.
I can add a little bit on the Catholicism side. I was taught that our Blessed Mother told us that we have one life and one life only. So this is very interesting to hear that somebody says that Catholics believe in reincarnation, because I do not believe that is how the Catholic Church teaches. So, but that's okay, because we're all here to learn and to share. So, but that is my understanding. That is my belief. Thank you. Amen.
Amen. And since I brought it up, I'll do the research. It was something about the history of the church that she was referring to, and something with the church fathers coming together and deciding which doctrines were going to be taught and which doctrines were going to be left out. So it was in the early stages of Christianity
that was probably with the Nicaea.
Council of Nicaea.
The Council of Nicaea. So I think that was in the 300 to 400
Yeah.
after,
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll
As
look into it and see
As
what I find.
Renee, that's something
Yeah.
that I talk about when I teach Christianity.
Oh,
And so
okay.
I thought I'd just add,
Sure.
4th century was the Council of Nicaea, 325 actually. And
Mhm.
but in that century, there was a Saint Ambrose, and he said, "It is a cause of wonder that though they, the heathen, say that souls pass and migrate into other bodies, but let those who have not been taught about the resurrection. For those who have read the law, the prophets, the apostles, the gospels, it is not lawful to doubt." So reincarnation is traditionally was a point of real contention because there were those people who believed in reincarnation, and Kupala is accurate. In the 4th century, there was a discussion about that. And there was literally voting on it at the church councils, and it was decided that reincarnation would not be accepted. Now, as far as the more recent situation, I don't know, but from the 4th century, the official Catholic line was not a belief in reincarnation.
Well, that's interesting because another religious studies teacher thinks that Catholics exempted themselves from that decision. So I'll look into it.
Yeah,
it's
but what
interesting.
she said, what the person from last week said about the more current, I haven't heard about that, so I don't know. And she may be totally correct.
No. She was talking about the Council of Nicaea.
Oh, yeah, well, Council of Nicaea, they clearly voted against it.
Okay.
Well, in one of the councils, I don't know if it's Council of Nicaea, but it was during the 4th century, and there were several during that century. So,
Okay.
Let's demand a recount.
yeah, exactly.
I'm not a religious scholar. I have a feeling Isaiah slipped in anyway, though. I think there are some passages about that Isaiah is going to come back. Somehow something slipped in there, but
well, I just love that we can have these conversations and have people from different traditions, being represented here. Often when Kirk speaks, he's speaking from a Buddhist perspective, and Mary joins us from the Catholic perspective. Ram Dass has been a Hindu sadhu, and Diana has been both Christian and Buddhist. And some of us here have, and I said Mary Catholic. I mean, so isn't it wonderful that we can all have these conversations? I want to thank all of you for joining and contributing to today's conversation. Thank you so much, Cliff, especially for your beautiful presentation.
Thank you, Cliff and Renee.